下方有附上连结，可以下载所提供的素材。
2,000 years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, one eternity later.
请帮我按赞和订阅一下，这样就不会错过更多精彩的内容咯。非常感谢你的支持。
3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later, later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 1 debt to society later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later, epilogue. The next day, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later. 1 week later, 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later. The following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later. 7 hours later, epilogue. Several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later. Yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later. The following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowland, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, later in the void. Approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later. Hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and a flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later!
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after, later, moments later, the next morning, many unbearable hours later, 82 kilometers later, a little later, 3 hours later, 1 season later. Many secret parties later, moments later, 1 nap later, 1 very long digestive tract later, 6 months later, 1 pathetic sob story later, many minutes later, 3 hours later, the next morning, 1 shift later, the next day, the next morning, later, the next morning, later that night, the next day, 1 weekend of pampering later, several days later, 1 hour later, late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
6 months later!
Meanwhile, 1 little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later, 1 hour later, 5 million years later,
2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. Later.
今天的影片就先告一段落，如果喜欢的话，请帮我分享一下。另外，你一定也会喜欢这里的内容，或者我也强烈推荐这一支影片。非常感谢你的支持。